מתארסכם.
אביכם שבשמיים, אביכם שבשמיים, אביכם שבשמיים, שבשמיים, אביכם שבשמיים, אביכם שבשמיים, אביכם שבשמיים, שבשמיים.
ואוימר ואוימר מקווה ישראל השם, ואוימר ואוימר מקווה ישראל השם, המקווה מתארס הטמאים, אף הקדוש ברוך הוא מתארס ישראל, המקווה מתארס הטמאים, אף הקדוש ברוך הוא מתארס ישראל.
Hello and welcome back to our In Defense Of series. This is our third installment, and today I want to have a look at Rabbi Akiva, and he is a very, very well-known individual in Judaism. He's fairly well known within Messianic circles, but there's kind of two views on him, two prevailing views, and the most dominant view, thankfully, in Judaism is that he was a great man. In fact, he lived between the 1st and 2nd century, and he became a leading authority in Judaism in his day and in the years passing right up until today. And he's one of the essential contributors to what's called the Mishnah, and the Talmud refers to Rabbi Akiva as being a Rosh, la-Chachomim, which means he's the head of all the sages. And so he is really, really high up there in Orthodox Judaism, and has been ever since he walked the face of the earth. And his life and times are exceedingly interesting, and it is absolutely imperative that somebody who is taking on a Nazarene walk and becomes a Messianic believer in Messiah and wants to join himself to or herself to the nation of Israel, it is absolutely imperative that one becomes familiar with this individual. And as we go through the lecture today, you will hopefully find out why it's so important to keep abreast of this man and what he taught, despite some controversial aspects to his life, which we'll also have a look at. And so that's why I've called this series In Defense Of, because it's a series that looks at mainly Orthodox Jewish things, although I do want to do an episode of In Defense of Rav Shaul, In Defense of the Apostle Paul, which obviously he was a Nazarene. So yeah, that's something hopefully I can look at doing in the next couple of weeks or months. Yeah, very much want to do a lecture on the Apostle Paul. Most people call him Paul, but his real Hebrew name was Shaul, which mean the one that we prayed for. That's what it means, the one that we prayed for. And so in the course of looking at these individuals, what makes these little lectures different is that we're looking at them from a uniquely Nazarene perspective. And so we're drawing out of them anything that we may find venerable and uplifting to our walk, and enlighten us into the ways of Yeshua, who is the living Torah, and hopefully these lectures will inspire people to become more interested in Judaism and want to get into some of the Jewish writings for the purposes of finding out a little bit more about the mind of our Messiah and how he thought and how he went about things and things like that. So that's the sort of the end goal to everything that we're doing, is to edify Yeshua, and through looking at things that are uniquely Jewish, sects of Judaism that have come and gone or have come and still here, and individuals who have come and been standouts in the Jewish faith in days gone by. So without any further ado, go and get yourself a cup of tea, go and get yourself a cup of coffee, sit down and join with me as we look at Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva is his beginnings are very, very interesting, because originally he was from very humble parentage. His father was a convert to the faith, and Akiva himself was considered somebody who was illiterate. Now, that doesn't mean that he couldn't read or write, but he was not very familiar with the Hebrew language, not very familiar with reading it or speaking it or writing it, though he did practice a Jewish faith. He worked as a shepherd, and he was working for a very wealthy landowner by the name of Kalba Suva'ah, and Akiva was very good at serving Kalba as a shepherd, and he was his chief shepherd, and he was a very driven man, a very work-orientated man, and had a good work ethic, and was very smart. And he was somebody that grew to loathe the rabbis and the master builders of the Torah, as we call them, and he had a real disdain for them, and it was said that he wished that he could bite every single one of them and give them a bite like a donkey, and so that just goes to show you the extent of the disdain he had for them. Mentioning the type of bite that he would want to give them, being that of a donkey who has very flat teeth, and if a donkey bites down on you hard and it hits bone, the bone gets crushed by the sheer breadth and the weight of the jaws coming together. So it's going to be very hard for somebody to heal if they've been bitten properly by a donkey on an area where there's bone. And so we can see that he started off very different to how he sort of ended up, and so what happened was he was unusual the way he approached his work. He was a man who was very enmeshed with whatever he was doing. So he was always 100% focused on what he was doing. He was never doing one thing and thinking about something else. And so his job was to look after these sheep, and he treated his sheep or his master's sheep with absolute finite care, and he would been often seen speaking to his sheep as though they were people, and dancing and singing and addressing his sheep in the same way that Moshe Rabbeinu would address some of the people in Israel in the wilderness. So he would kind of playfully pretend he was like Moshe Rabbeinu, because shepherds would often find themselves long periods of time by themselves and just with their sheep, and so they would often do things like this to pass the time. And his strange antics caught the attention of Kalba Suva'ah's daughter, Jewish daughter, Rachel, and she remembers Akiva from when she was very young, and she has grown into a young woman now, and her father was pretty good in keeping her away from his servants and his bondsmen, but Rachel was very fascinated with Akiva, and she would watch him tend the sheep, and she would like hearing him sing, and so eventually she came and started to speak with him, very, very unkosher, like to be found, a single woman speaking with a single man out in the field and so on, but she would defy her father and go out and willfully engage in conversation with Rabbi Akiva, and they would talk about the Torah, and she was a very pious young woman. She was a woman who was very driven and very, very much into the Torah, and it was her love, it was her desire, and she saw something in Akiva. She saw some spark of holiness and potential. She saw such great potential in him, and she really wanted to engage him and encourage him to perhaps take on a life of Torah study. And what happens is a series of discussions with Rachel encouraging him to leave his father's employ, go and study Torah, and she says if he does this, she will marry him. And he's sort of saying, no, I can't do it. How am I going to feed myself? Your father would never allow it. And they keep peppering one another back and forth. And so that's the kind of vibe that was going on. And what have I got here? Rachel really began to challenge Akiva about the Torah and its masters. So much so that Akiva contemplated her words very carefully. Now, one day while Akiva was contemplating her words, he was sitting down by a brook, and Akiva noticed a steady trickle of water hitting a rock. And it was only a drip, but it was constant. This drip was absolutely constant, drop after drop after drop. And Akiva observed something very incredible. And what he observed, whilst contemplating the things that Rachel had said, he saw this rock seemingly being able to, this water seemingly be able to penetrate this rock. And not seemingly, it was. And the hole, it began to be carved out by the steady dripping of the water. And then he wondered about how this happened, about how water can actually penetrate stone. And then he concluded that if something as soft as water can carve a hole in solid rock, how much more so can words of Torah, which is hard as iron, make an indelible impression on my heart. So this was kind of a defining moment in Akiva's early life, when he realized, you know what, maybe he could become somebody who was immersed in the Torah and becomes the Torah itself, and becomes prayer itself, as David says. So once Rachel's father, Kalba Suva, found out that these two were going to get together, because Akiva had agreed to marry her on the grounds that he would go and study Torah diligently, Kalba Suva was very angry, and he swore that while Rabbi Akiva remained her husband, he would have nothing whatsoever to do with his daughter or Akiva. And obviously Akiva, goes without saying, Akiva was sacked from his job, and they went and they lived, and they were very poor and they were very destitute. So much so that their bed was made of straw. And the Talmud relates a story that a very, very poor person, which they believe was actually Elijah, the prophet Elijah, in disguise, came to the door of the house, of their little cottage, and he asked a pregnant Rachel if he could borrow straw, because he was so poor. And this is when Rachel realized that there were people that were poorer than her and Akiva, and this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. This was kind of the point where she went, okay, Akiva, now go and study. I'll be okay. Look, there's people worse than us. And so at that point, Rachel says to Akiva, go and study, become a scholar. And so Rabbi Akiva disappeared. Now he attended the academy of his native town in Lod, presided over by Rabbi Elazar ben Harkanus, and he began his studies somewhere between 75 and 80 CE, which was probably around 5 or 10 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. So besides Eliza, get these pronunciations right, Akiva studied under Joshua ben Hanani and Nahum ish Gamzu. Both of these guys, all three, Eliza and Hananiah and Nahum ish Gamzu, these are very, very influential rabbis of their time as well. He was on equal footing with Gamaliel II. Gamaliel II was the one that's responsible for the Gamaliel II calendar, whom he met later, and whom Akiva met later, and Rabbi Tarfon was considered as one of Akiva's masters. Akiva actually went past Rabbi Tarfon in his knowledge and in his expertise in Torah, but it is the way within the realm of the Torah that a student never goes above his master. So even though a student excels high above his master, that student always reveres his master as being higher than him. Akiva lived in the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. Yeah, we said that. And a time when there was phenomenal sectarianism within Judaism. You had the zealots running around. You had the rightful Sadducees, the ones that were the real people who believed that they should be residing in the temple. You had the fake Sadducees, and the ones that were in Yeshua's day on Herod's payroll, and you had all sorts of different groups, sects, Essenes. You had those that were out in the Qumran community and things like that. And so there was a lot of factionalism within Judaism at the time. And Rome had been getting very aggressive against Judah, and there'd been a lot of bad things happen. There'd been a lot of loss of life and failed revolts and things like that, which would culminate towards the end of Rabbi Akiva's life as a great failed revolt by a man by the name of Shimon bar Kokhba, and he was believed to be the Messiah, which we'll get into later, and that had a very disastrous result for the Jewish people, and subsequently a disastrous result for Rabbi Akiva, and he left this world in a very painful way, which we're going to have a look at as well. And so, what else have I got here? Alright, so by agreeing with his wife, Akiva spent 12 years away from his home. Now this is something that I want to look at, which we'll get into in a sec. Returning at the end of 12 years accompanied by 12,000 Talmudim disciples, on the point of entering his home he overheard his wife, so he was gone for 12 years studying Torah, and at the end of 12 years he came back with 12,000 Talmudim. And then just as he's going to the front door of their cottage home, he overhears his neighbors criticizing his long absence and trying to get Rachel to sort of see that this is not acceptable. And she replies to her neighbors, which are spreading Lashon Hara about Akiva, if I had my wish, he should stay another 12 years at the academy. So without crossing the threshold, Akiva, on hearing this, went back to the academy. So he was going to come home and be with his wife, and then he heard that his wife said, I'm happy for him to be away for another 12 years. So he took his leave and he was gone another 12 years. And at the end of another 12 years, he returned with 24,000 disciples, Talmudim, and she was happy, so happy to see him. She'd missed him for so many years, and his disciples were sort of saying, who's this lady? So when his wife went out to greet him, some of his students, not knowing who she was, sought to restrain her, but Akiva acclaimed, let her alone, for what is mine is yours, for what is mine and yours is hers. She deserves the credit for our Torah study, in other words. Not knowing who he was, Kalba Suva'ah, which was Rachel's father, who had disowned her and taken a vow never to have anything to do with her while she was with Akiva, he also approached Akiva and he asked him for help and to annul his vow to disown his daughter and her husband, which was him. And Akiva asked him, would you have made your vow if you had known that I would become a great scholar? And Kalba Suva'ah replied, had I known that you would learn even one chapter or one single halakha, I would not have made the vow. And so Akiva said to him, I am that man. Kalba Suva'ah fell at Akiva's feet and gave him half of his wealth. According to one Baraita, a Baraita is an oral tradition that falls outside the Mishnah. According to one section in the Baraita, brought down in the Talmud, Akiva saw that at some future time he would take in marriage the wife of Tyrannus Rufus, who was a Roman executioner, and later on in Rabbi Akiva's life, he was Tyrannus was actually a sort of like a Roman noble who fancied himself as being a bit of a philosopher and often get into debates with Akiva, and Akiva would wipe the floor with him. And so Tyrannus's wife, she agreed to go to see Akiva and plot to actually somehow bring Akiva undone, maybe tempt him in some way or do something to blackmail him. Upon arriving at Akiva's doorstep, Akiva broke into tears looking at this beautiful Roman noblewoman, and she said, why are you crying? And his whole body was shivering, and he was just in such a state of distress and pain and anguish and crying that it disarmed Taranos Rufus's wife, and she said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, I see that you are a woman of such beauty, but I can see that in the future your body will be riddled with maggots, and you will be subject to the most harshest punishments that await a person in Gehenna." And this really scared her, and she said, okay, I get it. What do I do? I came here to blackmail you and somehow get you in a position where my husband would be allowed to bring you up on charges to have you executed. But now that I've seen the sincerity in your face and the wisdom that you have, and these insights that you've just given me, which frighten the life out of me, I want to convert to become a Jewess. What do I do to do that? And she was really sincere. Akiva could see that she was really sincere, and he ends up marrying her later on in his life after Rachel passes away. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. But these were some of the strange things that occurred in Rabbi Akiva's life. That's really, really interesting as we go through and we look at him and his life story. All right, so in the course of being acquainted with this fact that Akiva was away for 12 years and then another 12 years, there has been within the Messianic movement some criticism as to Akiva's suitability as a husband, and questions arising surrounding what he did as a father with his children, being not a good example for children because his dad's not around for 24 years. And so what I wanted to do was address this, go in the defense of here and address this situation, because to the Western thinking mind, this indeed does seem like a drastic thing to be away from a family and leaving a woman without sort of a stable income with children and everything like that. It can look a bit sort of grey. Okay, so the next thing I want to address is about Akiva's accusation that he was a bad husband and a father. It's clearly documented that Rabbi Akiva spent many consecutive years away from his wife and children. This has never been a secret. This is but this is this grounds to accuse him of being a poor husband and father and ultimately breaking the Torah? This is what they're getting at, these accusers. So let's have a look at the story and we'll see what's really going on. Upon returning home after 12 years of intense study, Akiva's wife says he can go away for another 12. So the extension of the other 12 years, unless his wife was lying and she was a pious lady, so we know she was being sincere in a response to her bad neighbors, she initiated the second leg of his study of the 12 years. So it wasn't Akiva's suggestion, it was his wife's suggestion, if you want to actually bore down into the heart of the matter. Here's the most authoritative account of the incident. Okay, so this is straight from this book here, and I recommend that all of you get a hold of this book. This is one of the most phenomenal books you'll ever get. It is the Akiva, the story of Rabbi Akiva in his times, and it is an amazing book, and it is the entire story written by Rav Meir Marcus Leman. And he was born in 1831 and died in 1890, and it's drawn from all the oral stories and traditions and various Jewish writings, and it pieces together his life. And some people question the authority of the sources, and some of them indeed are questionable in that, how do they know some of these intricate facts? And I remember Rabbi Abramson, Henry Abramson, who's also done a lecture on Rabbi Akiva, which I recommend you have a look at. He said that he wrote a letter describing the beauty of his wife's eyes, and when she received the letter that he wrote about his wife's eyes when he first met her, he found out that he actually got the color of her eyes wrong. But the point was that the beauty in the eyes and the way he described them and the way her eyes made him felt, that was the key, and that was not in error, even though he'd actually got the actual technical aspects of her eye color wrong. And he says it might have been because it was out in the snowy mountains, and the light must have been coming off the snow and making her eyes look a different color. But what he gets at is, even though the details of what his account of his wife's eyes were, even though the color was wrong, what he saw and the way it made him feel was correct. And that's how he kind of defends some of the the questionable sort of sources in this story on how the story is actually pieced together. But if you just pick it up and start reading it, you'll find you'll read a big chunk before you've put it down. You go, I'll just read a couple of pages. You'll end up reading a chapter or something like that. If you're a reader, you'll probably read it in one session. But it's such a fascinating book, and there's so many fascinating things that happen in this guy's life, and it's really one of the most beautiful love stories you'll ever read, because you see Rachel's love for the Torah and her love for Akiva, and she's really kind of the force behind Akiva's strength in the Torah. And so rather than him being seen as being a bad husband, it's actually Rachel that's kind of influencing him and orchestrating all these things to be happening. It's on her encouragement and things like that. And of course, he has to make the decisions, but it's really kind of a story about Rachel if you start to really get into it and look at this book. But definitely get this book. It is something worth picking up. You could probably pick it up for about it's $42 here. I've still got it. I got it at Gold's World of Judaica in Sydney. It's by Feldham Publishers. So definitely see if you can pick that up. And there are a few other books about Rabbi Akiva. I think there's one called Rabbi Akiva and Rachel, the greatest love story ever known. I think I've actually got a slide. Oh yeah, here we go. I've got a slide here with the cover of the book there, and it's you can see in the image there. It's Akiva's students all going in a sort of a long line up to their little cottage there, and Akiva's at the front, and his wife Rachel's coming out and meeting him at the front door. And there's this one here, and Akiva and Rachel, one of the greatest love stories of all time. I think that could be an ebook. I'm not sure if that's published in hardback. It might be. I tried to have a look for it briefly before I went to air, but I couldn't find it using the ISBN on ABE Books. But it might be a book. But it is online. You can get the whole book online, the whole story online, and there's a few other stories as well written revolving around Akiva and Rachel's relationship, and it's just such a beautiful thing. And I think all sort of Torah-abiding couples who are going to get married and going to spend a life together, they should read that book. Both of them should read that book and take it on board, because it really gave me a lot of understanding and behind a lot of ideas and things. It's basically coming from a Western mindset and putting yourself in a break mindset, and all the motives and drives and your desires are sort of turned on their head, and then all of a sudden the Torah becomes the source of everything that you want to kind of move towards. And if you do that at the expense of everything else, a lot of other things begin to sort of fade away, or they just happen to work out in ways that are bigger sometimes than we could have even dreamed of. Okay, so for 12 long years, Rabbi Akiva had not seen his wife and children. Now, this is quoting directly out of this book, Akiva, the story of Rabbi Akiva and his times. Only once during this time had he come to the village with the intention to visit them. Okay, and as he stood at the entrance of his house, he heard a loud, stringent voice of a neighbor criticizing Rachel harshly for her extreme loyalty to a husband who had been away for so long and had surely forgotten her. Rachel, who do you cause your father? Why do you cause your father to hate you because of this man? Why don't you just turn your back on your ungrateful husband and return to your father? He will surely be happy to take you and your children in. Do not speak negatively about my husband, this is Rachel, for being away for so long. So this is exactly kind of what took place, and this is how it's transcribed in this book. For it is with my consent and encouragement that he is doing so. Oh, if he becomes a great teacher of Israel, I would accept his absence for even longer, or another 12 years, some renderings say. And Akiva heard these words and his noble wife, and he immediately returned to Yavne without even having seen Rachel and the children. Rachel's dream had been fulfilled, and Akiva was rushing to go home. Thousands of his disciples accompanied him. People streamed from all directions to see the renowned scholar who was journeying with crowds of pupils following him. Rachel also heard about this, and her heart was filled with both joy and trepidation as she set out to welcome her beloved husband. Then she saw him surrounded by pupils, and she was about to rush toward him when his pupils blocked her way. But Akiva had seen her. Rachel, he cried, my beloved wife Rachel, Leave her alone. If not for her, I would have remained an ignorant shepherd. All my life and all your Torah, all my Torah and all your Torah are hers. And that's all from page 63 and page 64 of Akiva, the story of Rabbi Akiva and his times by Meir Lehman. Now it's important to backtrack a little here to get a complete picture. So before Rabbi Akiva commenced his studies in Torah, he held the same contempt that current critics have revived in his own ministry in regard to Torah, studying Torah and not participating in the toil of common married men. At this time, the recent death of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because at the time Akiva started his ministry, a prominent rabbi had passed away, which is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and had all Israel in mourning except the practical shepherd Akiva. And so Rachel would say, well, why aren't you upset? A great one has passed away. So she began to question Akiva about his lack of concern for this great rabbi who had passed away, because his view on the rabbis was, if I was a donkey, I'd bite them like a donkey if I could. Elam has taken away our greatest man. All of Israel is in mourning. Only you seem to care much. You seem not to care much about it. And this is again quoting from Akiva, page 15. Why should I grieve over someone who devoted his whole life for idle studies and misled the young men of Israel to do the same? Akiva replied, oh, how I detest those rabbis. They are so arrogant, and they set themselves apart from the rest of us as though they belong to a different breed of men. To them, a Jew who is ignorant of Torah is barely considered a human being. And again, that's from page 15. Rachel was not deterred by his lack of faith, or the lack of faith that Akiva had for the rabbis, so she began to share with him her awesome encounter with them, and she replied, and this is going on to page 16, it is the rabbi's task to pass on the Torah in its complete purity and holiness in the coming generations. You know, I remember when I was still a young child, how I would hear some of the great rabbis conversing in our house. I often heard them discussing the dangers threatening us. Oh, Akiva, if only you would take this task upon yourself. Yes, upon yourself. You would bring joy to your people for eternity. Elohim has granted you a keen mind and a strong will. Why don't you leave my father's herd and flocks and become instead the shepherd of our people? Page 16, Akiva, the story of Rabbi Akiva and his times. Finally, Akiva said, and if I were to decide to study, he's replying to Rachel here, I would have to dedicate my whole life to it totally, and in that case, I would also have to give up my work. On a subsequent encounter, unquote, they continued their discussion, and Rachel went in to describe how in Egypt the pious women of Israel made great sacrifices to make their husbands happy by disdaining their Egyptian masters, even to the point of having their children taken from them. Wow. So on page 22 it says, oh, if only I could find a wife who would stand by my side like that. I would happily dedicate myself to the study of Torah, even if I had no means to pay for food and clothing. But that wife would have to be someone like you, my master's daughter, although I would never dare approach you with such an idea. That's Rabbi Akiva's words there. Rachel then makes a vow by saying, you ready? If I knew that one day you would become a great teacher of Israel, I would not turn you down. But that would be an impossible condition to fulfill, replied Akiva. Then I would not turn you down if you promised me that I would dedicate your life to Torah, regardless of whether you fulfill that condition or not. So here we see the premise of Akiva's story, which is unquote. That's the end of page 22. So here we see the premise of Akiva's story, which was not so much his story, but the story of his wife's desire to have her vow fulfilled, and that is that she is the wife of somebody who is a leader of Israel in matters of Torah, a great leader, a great shepherd of Israel. This was his wife's dream. It wasn't initially Akiva's dream, it was his wife's dream. And his wife was so inspirational that he now wanted to make that his dream as well. So there's the story that behind every great man there's a greater woman. It's very true in the story of Rabbi Akiva and Rachel. The full story of Rabbi Akiva's life is actually a story about the desire his wife had for a profound fulfillment of Torah and holiness to be achieved in her time. Rachel was not interested in a house husband that dabbled in Torah. She was a determined woman who wanted to be partners with 100% focus Torah, scholar, and teacher of Israel. Sure, this was not the norm for everyone, so it's not everybody's calling to immerse themselves 100% in the Torah. Although that'd be great, I'm sure that was Moshe's desire for all Israel as well. So this is why we're taught that not many of you should become teachers, according to Yaakov 3:1 or James 3:1. And this is why Shaul HaShliach, otherwise known as the Apostle Paul, prefers a man to stay single if he can, where he says in 1 Corinthians 7:7, sometimes I wish everyone were single like me, a simpler life in many ways, but celibacy is not for everyone any more than marriage is. Okay, so the current criticism against Akiva's absence due to Torah study is based on other people's modern 20th century values being superimposed onto Rachel's quest to play a key role in elevating Israel. In turn, this makes Akiva out to be a lousy husband, and on a certain level, this is the same sin as Miriam, who rebuked Moshe for not fulfilling his marital role toward his wife during his critical role in elevating Israel. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe regarding the Cushite woman he had married in Numbers 12:1. Furthermore, all of the rabbis in Yeshua's Talmudim were married. All of Rabbi Yeshua's Talmudim, that is the Messiah Yeshua, his disciples, all of them were married except John. At the time of their apprehension by Yeshua, they were called away from their families with little notice. In one case, Yeshua calls 2 disciples away right in front of their father whilst they're on the job. In Matthew 4:22 it says, going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and they were in a boat with their father Zebedee preparing their nets. And Yeshua called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. Matthew 4:22. Wow, so that's pretty intense. So Yeshua himself displayed disrespect to his own mother and brothers when he called on when they called on him. Now, I'm not saying that he showed disrespect to them, but it can be taken like that when we read this passage in Matthew 12:47-49, where we read, someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. And he replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples. No, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. So he's basically saying, ones who follow me and do what I do, even though they're not biologically my mother and my brothers, if they do what I do and they follow me, then I consider them closer than my blood family. That's essentially what he's saying. Your family lineage is nothing unless you're actually willing to put some elbow grease into what the potential that you have because of your fine lineage. And as we see with Akiva, he had no good pedigree. He had no really good lineage to be backed up with, like Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, for example. But he nonetheless became one of the most standout people in Torah knowledge and teaching of his time and in generations since. And at other times Yeshua rebukes a convert who merely wished to go back and bid farewell to his own king. Still another said, I will follow you, Adon, my sovereign, my master, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Yeshua replied, no one puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom, according to Luke 61 and 62. So this is pretty harsh. So imagine if these were sayings by Rabbi Akiva, then these would further add to Rabbi Akiva's disdain by some people in the Messianic movement who were saying, oh, Rabbi Akiva, he was a bad father. He was somebody who was against the institution of marriage, or didn't really give the institution of marriage all the due concern that was needed for it. But in essence, by him going off and being allowed to study the Torah intensely, it would be bringing complete harmony within the home as best as possibly could be achieved, because of his constant desire to learn Torah. And as he learnt Torah, his wife Rachel was also receiving the merit of the exact same level of Torah understanding that he was actually gleaning those 24 years. So we know that Yeshua did nothing wrong in all the above citations, but these are examples of monologues that some might find themselves criticizing if similar language were used by other rabbis So imagine if these were uttered by, some of these sayings I've quoted from Yeshua, uttered by Akiva, like I said. Would his critics use this type of dialogue to support their negative views of him? Perhaps, and I've said perhaps here in my notes. So imagine if Akiva was recorded to having said the following words. So don't imagine these as Yeshua's words. Imagine these as Akiva's words, and they come from Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. You'd throw him to the wolves. Oh, Rabbi Akiva said that. See, told you he was a nut. Oh, no, it's the Messiah saying that, so that's fine. These are Yeshua's words, which are sounded, incidentally, which sounded. I basically said if they appeared in, if that said appeared in the Talmud like that, you would be like, okay, look at what these crazy rabbis are saying. If that statement appeared in the Talmud or any other Jewish writing. Probably the most compelling verse to support Rabbi Akiva's long absence from his wife is no better supported than in the Netzarim Ketuvim, the Nazarene writings, verse in 1 Corinthians 7:29, which says, "What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none." So, oh my gosh. So I'll read it again. It's from 1 Corinthians 7:29, Shaul's words. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. And that verse has been misinterpreted by many wacky religious cults over the years to go off and have extramarital affairs. But essentially what it's saying is that the work of the kingdom is the priority, and if somebody has the potential, then they should focus and funnel that potential in serving Yahweh, not forsaking the family, but the family being understanding in that it allows the husband to actually move forward and study the Torah with the freedom that is required. This is teaching us that in times of strife, when teachers and leaders are needed to step up the pace, i.e. men for the harvest, their marital obligations take a back seat, at least for a while. Some pervert this verse to support extramarital relations, which is a horrendous misinterpretation, which is what I already said. It's fine to question the great rabbis of the Torah as long as we're prepared to apply the same rule of measure to the rabbis and the Talmudim that we've grown up to revere and love within our own movement. To call evil what is being called evil is fine, but to call evil something that is not evil can cause others to make the mark. All right, so the next allegation is the Bar Kokhba, is support for Bar Kokhba, and the terrible situation that arose with him supporting a false Messiah, and we need to look at that. That's probably one of the biggies. Okay, so it all started when there was an Arab who encountered a Jew, and he said, "Rejoice, Judeans, for at this moment Mashiach has been born." And the Arab went on to name the place and name of the man. He said to the Jew that this particular individual was born in Bethlehem, on the day that the Holy Temple was destroyed, and he was named Menachem, which means the comforter or the counselor. And when the child was still very young, he was lost in a storm and found by a rabbi who named him Shimon because he didn't know his name, and he raised him as his son, and he grew into a strong and intelligent man who seemed to have an overwhelming desire to save Israel from all its plights. Years later, in Jerusalem, during a particular... years later, he was brought to Jerusalem during a particularly difficult time when the Romans had been oppressing them for quite a long time. The Second Temple had been destroyed, and there was just wave after wave of Roman revolts, Roman attacks, and the occupations were revolted against by Jewish zealots, and it was just went on and on and on. It was really wearing the Jews out, and it was just causing so much strife. In stepped this Shimon Bar Kokhba, and he was pegged as being fitting a lot of the expectations of who Mashiach is. He was a very good-looking man. He was very strong. he was very wise in the Torah, and he was eventually brought before Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva looked him over and interviewed him and talked with him a lot, and initially gives him his support. And so they begin to, all the Jews begin to fortify themselves, and for 2 years he leads a successful revolt against Rome. This is Bar Kokhba. And after 2 years, things start to come unwound. But before the 2-year mark, Akiva is smart enough to begin to see that he's not quite sounding like Mashiach after all, because the main thing is he began to put emphasis on receiving military support from allies who were not Torah observant. So he wanted to actually align with the Samaritans and have them join forces with the Jews. And Rabbi Akiva was like, well, no, that's crazy. These people aren't Torah observant, and we'll be compromising our Torah observance if we settle with these people and we wage a war with them against Rome. And so Bar Kokhba, he was like, no, not having any of that, Akiva. This is what I'm going to do. We're going to side with the Samaritans. And eventually it was the Samaritans that actually betrayed the Jews and withdrew at the last minute, and the Jews all got slaughtered. But by that time, Akiva had left because no one believed him. They were it was too late. There was too much of a groundswell and a momentum behind Bar Kokhba that they believed that he was Mashiach for Akiva to do anything about it. A wise man would have seen that Rabbi Akiva was no longer on the scene where he was initially at the beginning of Bar Kokhba's reign as this savior of Israel. But yeah, he just kind of went, well, no one's going to listen to me. I'm out. He took his attendant and he left. And so then there are a few more years of him sort of going around and kind of keeping out of the sight of the Romans. Leading up to that, the Bar Kokhba, there are some other events in Akiva's life that talk about him going on missions to appease Roman emperors, and along the way meeting a lot of Roman converts that are Roman noblemen and women who wanted to convert to Judaism, and he offered them a lot of advice and made a lot of good friends and things like that. But towards the end of life, when Bar Kokhba rebellion was full swing, he was kind of not on the run, but he was known to be somebody that would not stop teaching the Torah or reading the Torah, and so he was sort of enemy number one then from then on with the Romans. Now, one of the final incidences before his capture and death was he went into a city, and he wanted to find lodgings in the city for one night with his attendant and himself, and he had a donkey, he had a budgerigar or some sort of bird in a cage, and he had a donkey, a budgerigar. That was about it. He ends up lighting a fire, but this is after they're not allowed into the city, so they're rejected from going into the city. So they set up a camp a little bit out from the city off the road, and they light a fire. And during the night, and Rabbi Akiva would often teach that everything that happens is for a person's good. And during the night, a lion came and ate their donkey, and then their bird flew away, and it rained, and it put out their campfire. Now, later on in the night, this Roman army came in and actually took the city by force, enslaving and killing its occupants, and pretty much, just going mayhem from door to door in the city. And had Rabbi Akiva been in the city, him and his attendant would have been killed. And so the donkey was eaten, would have given their position away, or would have maybe made noises or something like that. And the bird would have definitely made noises and given their position away had it not flown away, and the fire would have definitely given their position away because they would have seen the light of the fire in the encampment. So yeah, he uses this bad situation to portray the fact that actually preserved them from actually being captured. However, not too long after that, Rabbi Akiva is indeed captured, and this is probably one of the most saddest incidences in his life. how he actually leaves the world. And the Romans capture him, and by this time he's over 100 years old. I think he's near on 120 years old, so he lives to quite a ripe old age. They decide to comb the flesh off his body, pin him down and begin to comb the flesh off his body. And during this very torturous execution, Akiva begins to recite the Shema. And his disciples, some of which get captured with him, they look on and they say to him, how are you able to just recite the Shema while they're actually tearing the flesh off your body? And he replies during the ordeal, and he says, all my life I've been troubled by this verse. You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your soul. As I've explained its meaning, all your soul. If they take your life, I have always wondered, will I ever have the privilege of fulfilling this mitzvah? And now that opportunity is finally arrived, shall I not seize it? According to the Talmud, the Talmud records Rabbi Akiva's last words as a long and drawn out echad. So Yahweh is your Elohim. Yahweh is echad, and that was his last words, echad. And so this was so basically he's saying that there was something about the Shema that always sort of plagued him. He was never really sure about, in that you shall love Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And he said, well, how do I know if I'm loving him with all my heart and all my soul unless I'm put to the test, essentially? And then now he's saying to his students, I'm being put to the test and I'm still reciting the Shema. I'm still affirming that I'm attached to my Maker as strong now as I ever was, even though I'm undergoing such severe torture and death. And this was something that gave him great joy. And so that was Rabbi Akiva. And that was a little bit of a window into his life and his extraordinary devotion to Torah learning. And not everybody is a Rabbi Akiva, and not everybody should go off and leave their family and go and study Torah. The main thing about what I wanted, the thrust of what I'm saying with Rabbi Akiva's conduct during his life and his relationship with Rachel, is that it was instigated by his wife Rachel. It wasn't his idea and she acquiesced to it. It was her idea and she pushed him, not against his will, but she got him, she made him excited about it, so it became his desire. You should never push somebody to do something. Rather, you should push them to have their own desire to do it, and then they will go off and do it because that's their desire. They've been inspired to have that as their desire now. And essentially, the study of Torah and living the Torah is the desire of every human being. We just have that closed off to us, and we have to actually break through and get and find it again. And so, yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to sort of look at with Rabbi Akiva. We shouldn't accuse him of being a bad father. We shouldn't accuse him of being a fraud because he put his weight behind a false Messiah. He swiftly changed his mind, and he ended up paying for it. Just because you became a tzaddik, you become a righteous individual, doesn't necessarily mean that you will not make mistakes. Sometimes mistakes that actually can be quite devastating. We see that King David made some very horrendous mistakes during his reign by eating the showbread in the Mishkan, causing all the priests to be slaughtered, and the way he did the count of the people caused the plague to also ensue and just wipe out all the people. So we don't throw David out with the wolves for doing that. We don't throw Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, out with the wolves, the bathwater out with the baby out with the bathwater. We don't throw him to the wolves because he backslid sort of towards the end of his ministry. His wisdom was still the most profound wisdom that has been uttered by any human being on the face of the earth. And so too, we should not do the same with Rabbi Akiva. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and hopefully I can do another one. Don't know what will be the next subject, but I do want to do one on Shaul, but we'll see how we go. Have a fantastic week, and hopefully I'll do another one of these again soon. Please hit like if you liked anything that I taught, and please subscribe to our channel. Bye now.